Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into economics.
It's economics.
Yeah, but don't worry.
No textbooks or anything like that.
Right. No textbooks, just real life stuff, like how economics shapes our lives, from like grocery shopping with your family to like those fancy diamonds you see on
the red carpet.
Yeah.
And we're not just going to like define terms or anything. We're going to connect concepts. Supply and demand.
Yeah, supply and
Opportunity cost, even a little bit of behavioral economics.
Ooh, behavioral economics. Fancy.
That we're going to be connecting all that to the real world. You might be surprised, actually, how much economics you're already,
experiencing every day.
Yeah, experiencing every day without even realizing it.
Okay, so let's start this deep dive somewhere familiar. How about your own home?
Okay.
Turns out that families are like these mini economic units participating in something called
Factor markets.
Factor markets.
And product markets.
And product markets. Whoa. Have your parents ever invested in bonds?
I see where you're going with this.
Boom. Factor market.
That's it. What's really interesting is that families actually wear two hats. They provide resources to those factor markets like labor, but they also buy goods and services in product markets. So
it's like a two-way street.
It is. Think about it. You go to the store with your family, buy groceries, new clothes, maybe even that video game you've been wanting. That's the product market in action.
Right. And all that buying influences demand, which keeps businesses running.
Exactly.
So basically, we're all part of this this big economic machine, whether we realize it or not.
Whether we realize it or not.
But here's where things get really interesting, okay? That feeling of having to finish a giant meal.
Oh, yeah?
Just because you paid for it.
You've been there.
Oh, totally. Turns out that's not just me. It's economics.
It is. It's called the sunk cost fallacy.
The sunk cost fallacy. I like it.
And the thali meal is like the perfect example. Okay, so imagine you order this amazing, huge 5-course thali, and it's delicious, but after like 2 courses, you are stuffed.
Oh. Yeah.
But you think, I paid for all this food. I can't waste it.
Right.
So you keep eating even though you're so full. But economically speaking, you're letting that sunk cost the money you already spent. You're letting it like control you.
Control my decisions.
Even if it's not the best choice anymore.
Okay, so my grandma telling me to clean my plate.
Oh.
That's bad economics.
Maybe just a little bit.
Mind blown. But seriously, it makes sense. Letting go of those sunk costs like, what's that saying? Spilled milk.
Spilled milk.
It's actually smarter economically.
It is. Speaking of markets and decision-making, have you ever thought about diamonds?
Diamonds. Oh, yeah. Sparkly.
They're not just luxury, though. They're a great case study for how global supply and demand, along with the actions of, nations really impact prices.
What kind of nations are we talking about here?
Well, big producers like Russia and South Africa, all of that plays into the availability of these little sparkly stones.
Ooh, diamonds. Okay, now this is where it gets juicy, right?
It does get interesting.
We're talking cartels.
Cartels.
International intrigue.
Maybe not a heist movie, but definitely cartels.
Okay, no heist movie, but cartels. Got it.
See, diamond production is often controlled by these agreements between producers, and they agree to limit supply to keep those prices high.
Makes sense.
It sounds simple enough, but these agreements, they can be fragile. Okay, imagine 2 kids sharing a bag of candy.
Okay, I'm imagining.
Each kid is tempted to take more, right?
Yeah.
Even though it means less candy for everyone in the end.
Yeah.
That's the challenge with cartels. Every member has this incentive to cheat.
To cheat.
To produce more than their share, to,
maximize their profits.
Exactly.
So even in the world of all those sparkly diamonds, there's this big economic game going on?
There is.
Behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes.
But what about OPEC? What about their influence on oil prices? They're like a real-life cartel. Right?
They are. But OPEC is a little bit more complex than just a simple cartel. It's this delicate dance between cooperation and self-interest, but on a global scale.
Yeah.
They try to control oil prices by setting, production limits.
Production limits, right.
For all those member countries. But like with any cartel, it's tough to keep everyone on the same page.
Why is that? I mean, they control so much of the world's oil. Shouldn't they be calling the shots?
Well, it's not quite that simple. So you have countries that produce oil but aren't in OPEC, like Norway.
Okay, Norway.
Britain.
Right.
their decisions affect the global prices too. And then, of course, you have those OPEC members who might be tempted to produce a little extra, to boost their own profits.
Even if it weakens the whole cartel.
Exactly.
It's like everyone's trying to play the market to their advantage.
They are.
So controlling something like oil, a global commodity like oil, is a lot more complex.
Much more complex
than it seems. But speaking of complex, how about we move on to a concept that I always get a little confused about?
Uh-oh. Which one?
Elasticity.
Elasticity.
Yeah.
Don't let the word scare you. When we talk about elasticity in economics, we're really just talking about how sensitive the quantity demanded, of a product is to changes in its price.
Okay, so do I need to imagine, like, rubber bands here or something?
That's actually a pretty good analogy.
Yeah.
Imagine two products, let's say a life-saving medication and a really fancy watch.
Okay, medication and a fancy watch. I'm with you.
Now, if the price of that medication suddenly doubles, people are probably still going to buy it.
Right.
Because they need it.
Right, they need it.
We call that inelastic demand. But if the price of that fancy watch doubles, people might think twice. It's luxury,
Yeah, they might not need it as much.
Exactly. That's what we call elastic demand.
Okay, that makes sense. So elasticity is about how much people's buying habits change when the price changes. But how does that actually play out in the real world?
Okay, let's take heating oil. Imagine there's a sudden price spike.
Okay.
In the short term, people might not be happy about it, but they're still going to pay, right? They need to heat their homes.
Right, got to stay warm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But over time, what do you think happens?
Well, maybe they start looking for alternatives, like maybe better insulation or I don't know, switching to a different energy source if they can.
That's it. So you see, the longer people have to adjust, the more elastic that demand becomes.
Like they're finding ways to stretch their budget.
Right.
And their options.
Exactly.
Speaking of stretching, how about we stretch our economic imaginations and take a trip to
where to?
New York City.
New York City, the city that never sleeps.
And
a perfect place to see how seemingly totally unrelated markets are actually connected. Remember the concept of complements, goods that are often consumed together.
Like peanut butter and jelly, classic combo.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, let's say the price of hot dogs in New York suddenly goes way up.
Okay, expensive hot dogs.
What do you think happens to the demand for ketchup?
Well, if people are buying fewer hot dogs, then I guess they'd need less ketchup.
Right.
So the demand for ketchup would go down.
You got it. But here's where it gets really interesting, that drop in ketchup demand. It could actually ripple through the market and affect the price of tomatoes.
Wait, tomatoes? Like the main ingredient in ketchup?
Exactly. So the price of hot dogs goes up, demand for ketchup falls, which leads to lower tomato prices, which could even impact the price of tomato juice.
Whoa, that's like a domino effect across different markets.
Exactly. It's a great illustration of just how interconnected our economic world really is, even small changes,
Small changes, big impact.
Exactly.
That's incredible. It makes you realize that economics is everywhere.
Everywhere.
Even in something as simple as buying a hot dog. Now, we've touched on different market structures like
cartels,
right? But there are so many others to explore, right?
So absolutely. One that's particularly interesting is monopolistic competition. Think about bottled water.
Bottled water?
Yeah, there are tons of different brands, but they're all selling essentially the same thing.
Yeah. It seems like a really competitive market. You walk down the beverage aisle, and it's like a sea of bottled water.
It is competitive, but here's where the monopolistic part comes in. Each brand tries to create its own mini-monopoly.
A mini-monopoly? How do they do that?
By differentiating its product. Fancy labels.
Fancy labels, yeah.
Catchy slogans.
Catchy slogans, okay.
Claims about purity or where the water comes from.
Right. I get it. So they're all trying to carve out their own little piece of the market.
Exactly.
Even though it's still super competitive overall.
Exactly. That's why it's called monopolistic competition. Each brand has some control over its price because it's selling something a little different.
Even if it's just the perception of being different.
Exactly.
Okay, I get it. But how is that different from a true monopoly? Like, think about electricity or water.
Okay.
Usually there's only one company providing those.
You're right. Those are great examples of monopolies. And those often exist because it's just more efficient to have one company, Imagine having multiple companies laying down separate water pipes or power lines.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Wouldn't make much sense.
Yeah.
We call those natural monopolies.
Natural monopoly. So sometimes a monopoly can actually be a good thing.
It can,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to those essential services.
Okay, I get it. But how does the size of the market affect all of this?
Oh, the size of the market. That's a key ingredient. A natural monopoly might make sense in, say, a small town, But as the market grows, as more customers come in,
More customers, yeah.
it might be more efficient to have multiple companies, competing.
Right, competing to give customers better prices.
Exactly.
So it's this balance between efficiency and competition. But enough about market structures. Let's talk about what keeps businesses running.
What's that?
Costs of production.
Yes. The heartbeat of every business.
Yeah.
And we can't talk about costs without talking about the difference between the short run and the long run.
The short run and the long run. Okay.
So in the short run, businesses have certain costs they can't change, right? Like rent or salaries.
Right. Those are their fixed costs.
Fixed costs, exactly. But in the long run.
In the long run, they have more flexibility.
Exactly. They can make bigger decisions, expanding their facilities, investing in new technology, or even, shutting down entirely.
Yeah, big decisions. So it's like the difference between adjusting your daily spending and making like a major financial decision.
Exactly.
And understanding those cost structures can help businesses make those strategic decisions.
Absolutely.
About how much to produce, what prices to charge.
Exactly.
And even whether to
stay in business.
Yeah. Imagine you're the CEO of a company.
Okay.
And things are tough. You're not making as much profit as you want.
Tough times.
Yeah. What factors would you consider to decide whether to keep going or?
Or a close-up shop.
Yeah.
Well, first thing I'd look at is revenue and costs. If my costs are consistently higher than my revenue,
then you're losing money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'd have to think about shutting down. But what about those fixed costs we talked about? How do those fit in?
Well, that's where the short run versus long run comes in, right?
It does. In the short run, a company might choose to keep going, even if they're losing money, as long as they can cover those variable costs.
Variable costs, the ones that change with production.
Exactly. Think of it like minimizing losses.
So if I'm losing money, but I can still cover those day-to-day expenses, I might keep going for a while, hoping things will turn around.
You might. But in the long run, if a company can't cover all its costs, both fixed and variable,
then it's time to call it quits.
It might be. Tough choices,
Makes you realize that running a business is this constant balancing act.
It is.
Weighing costs and revenue, thinking short-term and long-term.
It's all part of the dance. Now, let's imagine a company doing really well.
Okay, things are good.
Like a record company, right?
Right.
They release a hot new album. Everyone wants it.
Okay, a hit album.
Yeah, a hit album. They need to figure out how many copies to make and what price to charge.
Sounds like a classic supply and demand puzzle.
It is. They need to find that sweet spot to maximize those profits.
So they're considering production costs, how much demand there is at different prices, and even like how much they have to pay the artist, right?
Exactly.
That makes you wonder about the power dynamics in the music industry.
It does.
How much say do artists have when they're negotiating with, the big record labels?
It's a great question. Artists have a unique talent, right? The record companies need that to sell their product. But the artists also need the company's resources.
To reach a wider audience.
Exactly. It's a constant negotiation. It's this balance of power and economics.
So it seems like economics is, it's not just numbers and charts. It's really woven into the fabric of the music industry.
It is.
From production to artist contracts. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about a topic that can sometimes be a bit controversial.
Uh-oh. Which one?
International trade.
Ah, yes. The flow of goods and services across borders. A topic that definitely sparks debate, but economists generally agree that trade can be a win-win.
A win-win for all the countries involved.
Yeah.
But why is that? Wouldn't it make more sense for countries to just, make everything they need themselves?
That's where the concepts of absolute advantage and comparative advantage come in.
Okay, absolute and comparative advantage.
A country has an absolute advantage when it can produce, a good or service using fewer resources than another country.
So if country A can produce 10 cars with the same resources it takes country B to make 5 cars, then country A has the absolute advantage.
Exactly. But comparative advantage is a little trickier. It's about the opportunity cost of production.
Opportunity cost, the value of the next best thing you give up when you make a choice.
Exactly. So even if a country is really good at producing, multiple things, it might make more economic sense for them to specialize in the thing they're best at, the thing where their opportunity cost is lowest, and then trade for the other stuff.
So it's not just about being the best. It's about figuring out how to use resources most efficiently.
Exactly. And that's why economists often advocate for free trade.
Free trade.
It allows countries to focus on their strengths, trade with each other, and boost prosperity for everyone.
Okay, I see. But what about those arguments we hear about protecting, domestic industries from foreign competition?
Those are important concerns, and there are definitely times when trade barriers might be necessary.
Yep.
But most economists believe that in the long run, the benefits of free trade outweigh the costs.
Sounds like international trade is a complex mix of economics and politics.
It is.
But let's move on to a concept that's a little more, a little more straightforward.
Okay, which one?
The invisible hand of the marketplace.
Ah, yes. Adam Smith's famous metaphor.
It's the idea that even though everyone's looking out for themselves,
right,
individuals and companies, their actions in a free market can actually lead to good things for society as a whole.
Exactly. Think of prices as signals, right?
Yeah.
They communicate information about supply and demand. When prices are high, it encourages producers to make more and consumers to maybe buy a little less.
Okay.
When prices are low, the opposite happens. It's a self-regulating system that ideally, allocates resources really efficiently.
So it's like this natural balancing act driven by individual choices but leading to collective results.
That's the idea. Of course, the real world is never quite as simple as our economic models, right? There are always things like government policies,
right,
market imperfections,
okay,
and even our own, weird little behavioral quirks. All of that can throw things off.
Right. It's not perfect, but it's a powerful idea for understanding those forces in the market. Now, let's talk about a topic that's often making headlines these days.
Which is?
Inflation.
Ah, yes. The rising cost of goods and services. It's a topic that can cause a lot of anxiety, but, it's important to understand what causes it and how it affects everything.
So what are some of the main drivers of inflation?
Well, there are two main types. Demand pull inflation.
Demand pull.
And cost push inflation.
Okay. Demand pull and cost push.
Demand pull is what happens when there's too much money going after too few goods. Like, think about when a new product comes out and everybody wants it.
Like those limited edition sneakers. The price just keeps going up.
Exactly. That's demand pull. Now, cost push inflation happens when the costs of production increase. Businesses have to raise their prices.
So like when oil prices go up.
Exactly. It affects transportation, manufacturing, even the food we eat. So whether it's driven by demand or supply, inflation can really hit our wallets.
Makes it harder to buy things.
Exactly.
But what about those government policies, that are designed to address things like pollution? How does economics fit into that?
That's where corrective taxes come in.
Huh?
It's a tool governments use to encourage good behavior, environmentally friendly behavior, by making polluting activities more expensive.
So instead of just setting limits on pollution,
right,
the government can use taxes to influence how much companies pollute.
Exactly. Economists often prefer this approach because, it can be more efficient and encourage innovation.
So it's aligning those economic incentives with environmental goals. Pretty clever. But let's turn our attention to those companies that have a lot of control over the market.
You mean?
Monopolies.
Monopolies. They often get a bad rap.
Right.
But are they always bad?
Are they always bad for consumers?
That's a great question. It's important to remember that not all monopolies are created equal. Some are actually created by the government.
Wait, really? How does that happen?
Think about patents and copyrights. Those give inventors and creators exclusive rights to their work for a certain amount of time.
Right, to encourage innovation.
Exactly. If people knew their ideas could just be copied, they might not put in all the effort.
Yeah, that makes sense.
To, develop those creations.
So a monopoly in some cases can be good for society because it promotes progress.
Exactly. But of course, there are situations where monopolies could be harmful, They lead to higher prices.
Right.
less choice for consumers. That's why governments often step in, to regulate those monopolies and try to prevent them from abusing their power.
So it's about finding that balance
It is.
between encouraging innovation and protecting consumers.
Exactly.
Well, it seems like economics is always about finding the right balance. But let's switch gears again and talk about this big picture economic measure.
Okay.
GDP, gross domestic product.
GDP.
We hear about it all the time.
All the time.
But what does it actually measure?
GDP. It's the total value of all the goods and services produced within a country's borders.
Okay.
Over a specific time period, usually a year. It's like a snapshot of the country's overall economic activity.
So if GDP is growing, that means the economy is doing well.
Generally speaking, yes.
Yeah.
It usually means businesses are producing more, people are earning more.
Okay.
The economy is humming along. But it's important to distinguish between nominal GDP
A nominal GDP.
and real GDP.
Okay, what's the difference?
Nominal GDP is calculated using current prices. Real GDP adjusts for inflation. So real GDP gives us a clearer picture of the actual growth, taking into account the fact that the value of money, well, it changes over time.
Right, right. So if nominal GDP is going up, but real GDP is flat or even going down,
Wrong.
that means inflation is eating away at any gains in economic output.
Exactly. And that's why economists focus on real GDP when they're trying to see how healthy an economy really is. Now, here's a fundamental concept.
Okay, hit me with it.
A country's income must equal its expenditure.
Wait, really? But what about people who save a lot and people who spend more than they earn?
You're right, that's true on an individual level. But when you look at the economy as a whole, every transaction has two sides, right?
A buyer and a seller.
Exactly. My spending is your income, your spending is someone else's income.
It's all connected.
Exactly. It's a giant circle.
So it's like this giant economic ecosystem where everything is connected. But GDP measures a country's output. What are the specific ingredients that make up GDP?
Well, we can break it down into four main components. Consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports.
Net exports. Got it.
Okay, so consumption, that's all the spending by households on goods and services.
So like food, clothes, entertainment, all that fun stuff.
Exactly. Everything we buy regularly, it all falls under consumption.
Okay. What about investment?
Investment is the spending by businesses on things that will boost future production. So like new equipment, machinery, buildings.
So it's not just spending, it's spending with a purpose.
Exactly. It's about building for the future. And then you have government spending.
And government spending, that one's pretty self-explanatory.
It is. That's all the spending by the government at all levels. It covers things like education, healthcare, infrastructure projects, even defense.
Okay, so the last one, net exports. That's the difference between what a country exports and what it imports, right?
Exactly. If a country exports more than it imports, it has a trade surplus.
Which adds to its GDP.
Exactly. But if it imports more, then it has a trade deficit, which, well...
subtracts from the GDP.
Exactly.
So these four components, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, they all add up to a country's GDP. It's like a recipe for economic activity.
Exactly. And by looking at these different parts, economists can figure out the strengths and weaknesses of an economy and come up with ideas for policies that might help it grow.
Wow, GDP is a pretty powerful tool for understanding a country's economy. But it's definitely more than just a number.
It is. It reflects all those different forces we've been talking about.
Well, we've covered a lot today, from our daily decisions to GDP and global trade.
A lot of ground.
I feel like I'm definitely more economically aware now than I was an hour ago.
That's what the deep dive is all about, giving you the knowledge and the tools to understand the world around you.
Speaking of tools, what advice would you give to someone who wants to learn more about economics?
That's a great question. I would say stay curious. Don't be afraid to ask questions, challenge assumptions, and get different perspectives. The more you learn about economics, the better you'll be at making decisions, both for yourself and, for the world around you.
I love that.
Yeah.
So listeners, keep those economic gears turning. We'll be back after a quick break to dive even deeper into this fascinating world. Stay with us.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about all those hidden economic forces at play, like in diamonds and hot dogs and things. Now, I'm kind of curious, can we use this economic lens to look at something like used cars?
Absolutely. The used car market is actually a really great example of what we call perfect competition.
Perfect competition.
Yeah, though it's not, 100% perfect.
Used cars seem pretty far from a textbook example, right?
You're right. It's not perfect. But the used car market does have a lot of the same traits. Think about it. You have tons of buyers and sellers.
The cars are all different, but similar enough.
Similar, yeah.
And no one seller can really control the price.
Right.
It's all about supply and demand.
Okay, so if it's not perfectly competitive, what's missing?
One big difference is something called information asymmetry.
Information asymmetry.
Kitschy. It basically means the seller usually knows more about the car, its history, its condition, than the buyer does.
Yeah, yeah.
And that can change the balance of power a bit.
Right.
And don't forget about dealerships. They have a lot more resources and marketing power than, say, someone selling their car on Craigslist.
So it's not exactly a level playing field.
Not exactly.
But how does all that, how does that imperfect competition affect someone actually buying or selling a used car?
Well, supply and demand are still running the show, but it's not that simple. The price you get will probably be close to market value. But things like, how well you negotiate, the condition of the car, how much information you have, that can all make a difference.
So it's kind of a mix of market forces and individual choices.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see economics everywhere. Speaking of groups trying to control markets, it reminds me of OPEC.
OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries.
That's the one. They're often seen as like a classic example of a cartel, right?
They are, but OPEC is a little more nuanced than it might seem at first glance.
We were talking about cartels earlier with diamonds. They're basically groups of producers trying to control supply to keep prices high, right?
That's right. And OPEC does try to manage oil prices by setting, production quotas for its members.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're successful. Sometimes those prices are a bit harder to control.
Why is that? If they control so much of the oil supply, shouldn't they be able to just, I don't know, dictate the prices?
Well, it's not quite that straightforward. The oil market is pretty dynamic.
Dynamic, right.
There are big oil producers outside of OPEC, like Norway,
Okay.
Britain. Their production choices affect things too. And then there's the shale oil revolution in the U.S., that whole new supply.
New supply, right.
That's made it harder for OPEC to control the market.
So OPEC is dealing with competition from non-members, and they have to, I don't know, deal with the dynamics within the cartel itself.
It's a challenge.
It's like trying to herd cats, but with billions of dollars at stake.
That's a great analogy. The individual interests of the OPEC members, they don't always line up with the cartel's goals. For example, a country that's struggling economically, they might produce more than their quota.
Even if it hurts the cartel overall.
Exactly, to get more revenue for themselves.
So it's like this constant push and pull between cooperation and self-interest.
Self-interest, exactly.
Makes me wonder, can any cartel really control a global market like that in the long term?
That's a big question. Economists have been debating that for a long time. That temptation to cheat, to get those profits, it's a powerful force. But there are also incentives to work together and keep the cartel stable.
It's like
it's a balancing act.
Yeah, a balancing act between
individual goals
right.
and collective goals. It's a fascinating interplay of economics and game theory, but on a global scale.
Wow. I'm definitely rethinking what I thought I knew about cartels. Now, before we move on, can we circle back to elasticity for a second?
Elasticity.
Sure. It's a fundamental concept, right?
It is. It helps us understand how sensitive, the quantity demanded or supplied of something is to price changes.
So it's a measure of how much things stretch or shrink when the price changes. But how do we actually apply that to, the real world?
Let's say you own a business, right? And you're selling luxury handbags. You're thinking about raising your prices. Elasticity can help you figure out what might happen.
Okay, so if the demand for my handbags is inelastic, meaning people are willing to pay a lot, then I can probably raise prices without losing too many customers.
Exactly. But if the demand is elastic, meaning people are more sensitive to price changes,
yeah,
and they have other options, well, then a price increase might send them running to your competitors.
So understanding elasticity is like, I don't know, having a crystal ball for pricing. But
Right.
it's not just for businesses, right? It can help us understand how consumers, react to price changes too.
Absolutely. Think about gasoline.
Gas.
Yeah. When gas prices go up, people might drive a little less
Okay.
or carpool more, in the short term. But if those prices stay high, they might start thinking about more fuel-efficient cars,
Right, right.
maybe even different ways to get around.
So elasticity is about it's about the product, ND. It's about how much time people have to change their behavior.
Exactly. It's a dance between prices and choices.
Speaking of choices, let's talk about the decisions that businesses have to make, especially when it comes to costs.
Costs are the heart of every business. And understanding how those costs change, how they affect decisions, that's crucial. We already talked about fixed costs and variable costs, but let's dig a little deeper.
So fixed costs, those are expenses that don't change no matter how much a business is producing,
Right.
like rent or
Yeah.
insurance premiums.
Exactly. Those stay the same, but variable costs, those go up and down with production.
Okay, so let's say a bakery.
Okay.
Their fixed costs would be things like the rent for the bakery space and their employee salaries.
Right, right.
But their variable costs, those would be like the ingredients for the pastries.
The flour, the sugar.
Right, and the packaging.
Exactly.
So how do these different costs, how do they factor into a business's decisions?
Okay, imagine our bakery is thinking about adding a new line of gluten-free cupcakes.
Gluten-free cupcakes, okay.
They need to weigh the potential extra revenue from those cupcakes
Okay.
against the extra costs.
So they'd have to figure out like how much the ingredients cost,
Ingredient.
the packaging, maybe even extra labor to make those special cupcakes.
That's right. They'd need to see if the extra revenue from those cupcakes would cover those costs and add to their profit.
It's like a constant cost-benefit analysis.
It is.
But what if a business is having a rough time? What if revenue is down? How do those fixed costs play into their decisions?
It's a tough spot. In the short term, a business might keep going, even if they're not making a profit, as long as they can cover those variable costs.
To minimize their losses.
Exactly. But in the long run, if they can't cover both fixed A&D variable costs, it's probably not sustainable to stay open.
Tough choices.
There.
Makes you realize that running a business is more than just, selling a product. It's about navigating all these economic realities.
It is.
Now let's flip that around. Imagine a business that's doing amazingly well.
Okay, business is booming.
They've got this product that everyone wants. Demand is super high.
That's the dream.
How does that affect their decisions?
Okay, let's imagine a tech company, right? They've developed this groundbreaking gadget. Demand is through the roof.
Okay.
They're trying to figure out how to make the most profit while still meeting that demand.
It's a good problem to have.
It is. But it still takes some careful thinking. They might need to, ramp up production.
To make more gadgets.
Exactly. Which might mean expanding their facilities, hiring more people,
Okay.
even getting more resources.
But all of that, that comes with costs, right? How do they balance those costs with the potential profits?
It's all about finding the point where what we call marginal revenue, the revenue from selling one more unit equals marginal cost, the cost of producing one more unit.
So they need to figure out where making and selling one more gadget brings in the same amount as it costs to make it.
Exactly. Beyond that point, the costs start to outweigh the benefits.
Okay, I get it. It's all about maximizing profits and managing costs effectively.
It is. But let's not forget about another big factor, competition. If their gadget is a hit, other companies are going to want in on that.
So even when things are good, businesses need to be thinking about how to stay ahead of the game.
It's a constant game of chess.
Speaking of competition, how does that work on a global scale? Let's talk about international trade.
Ah, yes. International trade is fascinating. It's all about how countries interact economically, exchanging goods and services across borders.
We talked about this a bit earlier, the idea that countries benefit from specializing in what they're good at and trading with each other.
Right.
But doesn't that also mean there are winners and losers?
That's a common concern, and it's true that some industries and workers might face challenges from, imports.
Like if a country starts importing clothes from another country where it's cheaper to make them,
Right.
the domestic clothing makers might have trouble competing.
Exactly. But those cheaper imports can also benefit consumers who can now buy those clothes at a lower price.
So it's complicated.
It is. It's a whole web of trade-offs.
Mm.
Economists debate this all the time. What's the overall impact of trade on different parts of society?
Okay.
Some say the benefits of free trade, like lower prices, are bigger than the costs.
Okay.
Others say we need to protect domestic industries and jobs.
So it's about finding the right balance again.
It is. Taking advantage of those benefits of trade
Uh-huh.
while also making sure we're not hurting anyone in the process.
And that's where government policies come in, right? To try to create, I don't know, a level playing field.
Exactly. Policies and trade agreements can help regulate trade, make sure competition is fair, and address concerns about things like labor standards and the environment.
It's like trying to, I don't know, manage a global economy. Sounds complicated.
It can be. But speaking of big ideas, let's revisit the invisible hand of the market.
Oh, yeah. The invisible hand. I remember learning about that, but I'm not sure I fully grasped it.
It's one of those famous ideas in economics
Yeah.
and often misunderstood.
It's something about how individuals being selfish actually can benefit everyone, right?
That's the idea.
Yeah.
Adam Smith argued that when individuals and businesses are just trying to do what's best for themselves within a free market, that can actually lead to good things for the whole economy.
But how does that actually work?
Okay, think about it like this. A business owner, they're trying to make as much profit as possible, right?
Right.
So they have an incentive to produce things that people want at a price they're willing to pay. That competition for profits, it leads to innovation, efficiency, and ultimately benefits for consumers, Better products, lower prices.
So it's like everyone's looking out for number one, but it ends up creating a more prosperous society overall.
That's the theory. Of course, the real world is never that simple.
Right. There are always exceptions.
Exactly. But the invisible hand is a good way to understand how market forces can work to create positive outcomes.
It's like this unseen force guiding the market towards, I don't know, a balance. But where does the government fit into all of this?
Governments play a crucial role. They have policies that affect everything.
Taxes, spending.
Taxes, spending, regulations, trade agreements, you name it.
So it's not just about letting the invisible hand do its thing?
Not always. Governments often need to step in to address what we call market failures.
Market failures.
Yeah, those are situations where the market, left to its own devices, doesn't produce the best results.
Like pollution, right? We talked about that.
Exactly. If a factory is polluting, it's creating costs for everyone, but those costs aren't reflected in the price of its products. That's a market failure.
Because the market isn't accounting for those costs. So the government might step in with regulations or taxes to try to reduce that pollution.
Exactly. Governments also provide, public goods, things that are hard or impossible for the market to provide on its own.
Like national defense or public parks.
Exactly. Those benefit everyone, even if not everyone pays for them directly.
So the invisible hand is powerful, but governments have a role to play too.
They do. It's this constant back and forth, market forces and government actions, each trying to achieve their own goals.
It's like this complex dance. Now, let's talk about something that makes a lot of people nervous.
What's that?
Inflation.
Inflation. Rising prices. It's both fascinating and a little worrying.
Yeah, we all feel it, at the grocery store, at the gas pump. But what actually causes it?
Well, there are a few things. A common one is an increase in the money supply, if there's more money out there. But the amount of, stuff to buy hasn't changed.
Stuff to buy, you mean goods and services?
Exactly. Then prices tend to go up.
Too much money chasing too few goods.
Exactly. Another common cause is when production costs go up.
Production costs, okay.
Like if the cost of materials or labor or energy increases, businesses often have to raise their prices to make up for it.
So whether it's from the demand side or the supply side, inflation makes it more expensive to buy things.
Exactly. It eats away at our purchasing power.
And that's where central banks come in, right?
Central banks, like the Federal Reserve in the U.S., they try to keep inflation under control.
Under control, okay.
Using things like interest rates and what we call monetary policy.
It sounds complicated.
It is a real balancing act. Speaking of complex, let's talk about GDP. Gross domestic product.
GDP. We hear about it all the time, but I'm not sure I fully get what it measures.
GDP is a fundamental way to measure how an economy is doing.
Okay.
It's the total value of everything produced within a country.
Everything.
All the goods and services.
Okay, goods and services.
Over a specific period, usually a year. It's like a snapshot of the economy's size and health.
So if GDP is growing, that's a good thing.
Generally speaking, yes. It usually means the economy's doing well, businesses are producing more, people are making more money. But it's important to remember that GDP is just one measure. It doesn't capture everything about, a society's well-being.
What are some of the things it doesn't capture?
Well, GDP doesn't measure things like income inequality.
Okay.
How sustainable the economy is.
Right.
Or the value of, unpaid work, like taking care of kids or volunteering.
So GDP is useful, but it's important to look beyond just that one number.
Exactly. It doesn't tell the whole story.
But how do economists, actually calculate GDP? What goes into that?
There are a few ways to do it. The production approach, the expenditure approach, and the income approach.
Okay. Production, expenditure, income.
The production approach basically adds up the value added by all the different industries in the economy.
Added value.
It looks at the final goods and services produced minus the value of the stuff used to make them, the intermediate goods.
So it's about looking at the total output of each industry and adding it all together.
That's right. Then there's the expenditure approach. That looks at GDP from the spending side. It adds up all the spending on those final goods and services by households, businesses, the government, and people from other countries.
So it's tracking where all the money is going.
Exactly. And the income approach,
Yeah.
that looks at the income earned by everyone involved in making those goods and services.
So it's like looking at both sides of the coin, the spending and the earning.
Exactly. And all three approaches, they should, in theory, get to the same GDP number.
Okay.
Though there might be some small differences because of, data limitations.
So it's a complicated process, but it makes sense. Now, what about those situations where the market doesn't work quite right? What about market failures?
Market failures. Those are situations where the free market on its own doesn't use resources efficiently or doesn't create outcomes that are, good for society.
We talked about pollution, but what are some other examples of market failures?
Well, a common one is a monopoly or an oligopoly.
Monopoly, oligopoly.
Where one company or small group of companies has a lot of control over the market.
Right.
They can set prices higher than they would be in a more competitive market.
So, not good for consumers.
Not always. Another example is information asymmetry, where one side in a transaction has way more information than the other.
Like with used cars?
Exactly. The seller knows more than the buyer.
Right.
That can lead to, outcomes that aren't fair.
So market failures come in different forms, but they can have a real impact.
They can. They affect consumers and the whole economy.
So what can we do about them?
Governments often try to fix these market failures. They use things like regulations, taxes, subsidies, or even sometimes they provide those goods or services themselves.
So it's about finding the right balance again.
It is. The balance between letting the market do its thing and stepping in when things aren't working right.
Right. It's a constant debate. But I want to go back to opportunity cost for a second. That's a really important idea, right?
It is. It affects decisions big and small, personal and, society-wide.
It's about recognizing that every choice we make means giving something else up. Like there's no such thing as a free lunch.
Exactly. Everything has a cost, even if we don't see it right away.
Okay, so let's say I win $100. Okay. I could spend it right now, or I could put it in a savings account and earn, say, 5% interest.
So if you spend it now, you're missing out on that $5 in interest.
Right. That's my opportunity cost.
Exactly. Every decision involves a trade-off. We can't have everything, so we have to choose.
But how does opportunity cost, how does it work for bigger decisions, like government decisions about spending?
Imagine the government's deciding whether to invest in a new highway. They have to think about the cost of building it.
Right.
But also the opportunity cost. What else could they do with that money? Could they improve schools, fund healthcare research, invest in renewable energy?
So they have to weigh all those options and choose the one that will benefit society the most.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Economics helps make those decisions. It's all about analyzing those costs and benefits, understanding those trade-offs, and thinking about the long-term impact of those choices.
It seems like economics is really everywhere, shaping our choices.
It is.
Influencing government policies, driving all those forces that shape the world.
It is, and the more we understand about it, the better we'll be at navigating this world.
Navigating this world, making good choices, and contributing to a better society.
Exactly.
That's a great thought. We've covered so much today, from everyday decisions to the big challenges facing governments.
It's been a great deep dive. Hopefully our listeners are feeling a little more economically savvy.
Economically savvy.
And maybe even a little inspired to learn more.
I know I am. So listeners, keep those economic gears turning. Stay curious, and join us next time for another deep dive. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been exploring all sorts of economic concepts, from the choices we make every day to those big forces that shape, well, the whole global economy. But I'm curious, how does all this theory actually work in the real world, when it comes to public policy and stuff?
That's a great question. Economics isn't just about, abstract ideas. It's a powerful tool for solving real-world problems. Let's take smoking, for example.
Oh, wait, smoking.
We all know it has huge costs, right, for individuals, for society.
Right, big health costs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Governments often try to discourage smoking through, different policies, like taxes or those awareness campaigns.
Right, those warning labels on cigarette packs.
Those are hard to miss. But economics can help us figure out how well these policies might work. Remember, price elasticity of demand.
Price elasticity, yeah. How much people react to price changes.
Exactly. So if a government wants to reduce smoking, they need to understand how smokers will respond if cigarette prices go up. If demand is inelastic, meaning people aren't that sensitive to price.
They'll keep buying, even if it's more expensive.
Exactly. So raising taxes might not do much. But if demand is elastic, meaning people will cut back if the price goes up.
Then taxes could be really effective.
Exactly. It's about understanding behavior and using economics to, nudge people in a healthier direction.
But it's not always that simple, right? People's choices, they're not always just about price.
You're right. That's where behavioral economics comes in.
Behavioral economics, right.
It looks at all the, the psychological factors that influence our decisions. Have you ever bought something on sale that you didn't really need?
Ooh, all the time. Sales are my weakness.
That's a perfect example. Retailers are using our aversion to loss. We hate missing out on a good deal, even if we don't really need the thing.
So it's not always rational.
Not always.
Yeah.
But let's not forget another big concept, opportunity cost.
Opportunity cost. The value of the next best thing you give up when you make a choice.
That's it. It applies to everything. Big decisions, small decisions, personal decisions, societal decisions.
There's no such thing as a free lunch.
Exactly. Everything has a cost. Let's say you win $100.
Okay, I win $100.
You could spend it all now or put it in a savings account that earns, say, 5% interest.
Okay, I'm seeing where you're going with this.
If you spend it all now, you're missing out on earning that extra $5 in interest.
That's my opportunity cost.
Exactly. Every decision is a trade-off.
Okay, that makes sense for personal choices. But how does it work for, big things like government decisions?
Let's say the government is thinking about building a new highway.
Okay, a new highway.
They have to think about the cost of building it, of course, but also the opportunity cost. What else could they do with that money? They could, improve schools, fund medical research, invest in green energy.
So it's about choosing the option that has the biggest benefit for everyone.
Exactly. And that's where economics comes in. It helps us analyze those costs and benefits, understand the trade-offs, and think about the long-term impact of our choices.
It really seems like economics is everywhere. It affects the choices we make, the policies governments create, and all those forces that shape the world around us.
It is. And the more we understand about economics, the better equipped we are to navigate this complex world. We can make informed decisions and contribute to a more, prosperous and equitable society for everyone.
That's a really inspiring thought to wrap things up. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive, from those everyday economic decisions to the big challenges facing the world.
It's been a fantastic journey. I hope our listeners are feeling more economically aware and maybe even inspired to keep learning.
I know I am. So to all our listeners out there, keep those economic gears turning, stay curious, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.